I was preparing soup when my daughter-in-law hit me in the head with a ladle. "Who cooks like this? You're useless!" Jessica screamed as I felt the scalding metal burn my temple. My son, Richard, sitting in the living room, simply turned up the volume on the television as if he hadn't heard a thing, as if he didn't care. 5 minutes later, a crash shook the kitchen. Pots, plates, and my own body hitting the floor. Richard ran in and froze in the doorway. "Mom, what did you do?" he whispered, looking at me lying there among the shattered remains of my own dignity. But neither of us knew that I still had one last card hidden up my sleeve, a card that would change absolutely everything. But before we continue, check if you've already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know how far our stories of revenge reach. My name is Helen. I am 71 years old, with hands hardened by decades of kneading bread for others and a heart that, until recently, believed blindly in family loyalty. How naive I was, how blind I had been. 6 months ago, I buried my husband, Henry. 50 years of marriage evaporated one April afternoon when his heart decided to give out while he was watering the geraniums in the backyard. I found him there on his knees, the garden hose still dripping onto his brown shoes. From that day on, my world turned into silence and yellowed photographs. I was left alone in a house that was far too big, surrounded by memories that hurt to touch. Richard, my only son, insisted that I move in with him and his wife. "You can't stay alone, Mom. At your age, it's dangerous." He sounded genuinely worried on the phone. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So, I packed my life into 4 suitcases and left behind the house where I had raised my son, where Henry and I used to dance in the kitchen on Sundays, where every corner held pieces of us. Richard's house in the suburbs was modern, with gleaming hardwood floors and furniture that looked like it belonged in a catalog. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, welcomed me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, Helen," she said. She didn't call me Mom, just Helen, as if I were a stranger. From the very first day, I knew I had made a mistake, but it was too late to turn back. I settled into the guest bedroom, a cramped little space at the end of the hallway with a window that faced a dark alley. I hung my photos of Henry on the wall, carefully arranged my gray dresses in the closet, and tried to become invisible. That was my new role, to exist without getting in the way. Mornings started early. I would wake up at 6 a.m., brew the coffee, and make breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, freshly squeezed orange juice. Richard always came downstairs first, in a rush, his eyes glued to his smartphone. "Thanks, Mom," he would mutter without even looking up at me. Shortly after, Jessica would appear, wrapped in a green silk robe, her hair perfectly styled even at that hour. She would sit at the table and inspect every detail of my work with a critical eye. "The coffee is watered down," she would say, or, "The eggs have too much salt." Never a thank you. Never a single show of appreciation. I would just nod, smile, and try again the next day. I wanted to feel useful, necessary. I wanted to believe I still had a place in my son's life. Days turned into weeks. I cleaned, cooked, and did the laundry. I became a shadow moving through the house, sweeping up crumbs, folding towels, tidying up corners that no one else even noticed. Jessica worked from home as an independent consultant, always on important conference calls, always stressed. Whenever something went wrong for her, I was the easiest target. "Why did you leave this here?" she would yell, pointing to a forgotten mug on the end table. "You can't do anything right." Richard was present during those moments, but he never said a word. He would just look away as if it were none of his business, as if I wasn't his mother. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. I wondered where I had failed, what I had done wrong as a mother, and why my son allowed me to be treated this way. Silent tears would fall onto my pillow, and I would wipe them away before dawn. Because I couldn't show weakness. I couldn't give them a reason to get rid of me. But that afternoon, while I was preparing the hearty vegetable soup that Richard used to love so much when he was a little boy, something inside me broke. I was chopping carrots, focused on getting everything perfect, when Jessica burst into the kitchen like a hurricane. "What are you doing?" she asked with that sharp tone I knew all too well. "Soup for dinner," I replied softly without turning around. "Richard's favorite recipe." She stepped closer, peered into the pot, and wrinkled her nose in disgust. "This looks like pig slop. How much salt did you put in this? Are you trying to poison us? Her words were like knives. I tried to explain, but she didn't let me speak. She grabbed the heavy metal ladle from the stew, and before I could even react, she smashed it against the side of my head. The blow left me dazed. I felt the searing heat of the metal, the boiling liquid running through my hair, the sharp, throbbing pain in my temple. "Who cooks like this, you useless old woman?" Jessica screamed, her voice echoing through the entire house. I stumbled, clutching the edge of the stove to keep from falling. From the living room, the television could be heard. Richard was right there. He could hear everything, and he just turned up the volume. In that instant, something inside me died. The physical pain couldn't compare to the ultimate betrayal of that silence. My son, the boy I carried in my womb, the boy I raised with all the love I had, chose the sound of a TV show over my suffering. I stood leaning against the stove, the ladle still dripping soup onto the tiles at my feet. Jessica glared at me with eyes full of contempt, waiting for me to apologize, to drop to my knees, to beg for her forgiveness just for existing. But I could only think about Richard, about how the TV volume went up right when she screamed, about how he knew exactly what was happening and chose to look the other way. "You are pathetic," Jessica spat, crossing her arms. "Look at this mess. You can't even make a simple soup. I don't know why Richard insisted on bringing you here. You're a burden. A useless weight, just taking up space." Every word was a slap to the face. I wanted to answer, to defend myself, but my voice remained trapped somewhere deep in my throat. I tried to clean up, to wipe the drops of soup from the floor, but my hands were shaking violently. My head throbbed exactly where the ladle had struck me. Jessica stormed out of the kitchen, and I was left alone in the steam and the silence. 5 minutes. That was all the time I needed to make a decision. I looked at the pots lined up on the stove. I looked at the plates stacked in the drying rack. I looked at this kitchen that I had scrubbed clean every single day for months, trying to earn a place in a home that was never mine. And something inside me simply exploded. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was pure survival instinct. I grabbed the largest pot, the one containing the soup she had criticized so harshly, and dumped it all down the sink. The scalding liquid rushed down the drain with an almost violent sound. Then I grabbed another pot, and another. I let them drop some to the floor, others against the granite countertops. The porcelain plates slipped from my hands and shattered into pieces. The silverware flew through the air. It was a chaotic, liberating, necessary crash of noise. I heard Richard's hurried footsteps. "What was that?" he yelled from the hallway. When he reached the kitchen, he froze. His face went pale upon seeing me standing there, surrounded by overturned pots, spilled soup, and broken dishes. A trickle of blood was running down my temple, right where the ladle had struck me. "Mom, what did you do?" he whispered. But he didn't step closer. He didn't reach out to touch me. He just stared at me as if everything were my fault. Behind him, Jessica appeared, and her expression of shock quickly morphed into absolute fury. "She's crazy. Your mother is completely unhinged," she shrieked, pointing at me as if I were a dangerous animal. "Look at this mess." She destroyed my entire kitchen. "Call someone, Richard. This woman needs to be locked up." Richard looked at me. I looked back at him, waiting for him to say something, to defend me, to at least ask why I had done it. But he just shook his head, disappointed and ashamed. "Mom, why? Why do you do these things?" "Why?" I repeated, my voice sounding hoarse and broken. "Your wife hit me with a boiling ladle, Richard. She hit me. And you turned up the volume on the TV." The words came out like daggers. He blinked, looking confused, or perhaps just pretending to be. "I didn't hear it, Mom. I didn't know." "Liar." The word hung, suspended between us like poison. "You were right there. You heard everything, and you chose to do nothing." Jessica stepped between us, her face flushed with rage. "I am not going to tolerate this. I am not going to live under the same roof as this ungrateful old woman who respects nothing. Richard, you have to decide. Either she goes, or I go." The silence that followed was worse than any screaming match. I looked at my son, pleading with my eyes for him to choose me, to remember who raised him, who spent sleepless nights awake when he had a fever, who worked 2 jobs just to pay his college tuition. But Richard just stared at the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, thoroughly defeated. "I'm sorry, Mom. he muttered finally. But I think it would be best if you found another place. This just isn't working out. You're causing problems. You need to leave. The world stopped spinning. My heart stopped beating. Everything came to a halt. You're kicking me out? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Your wife assaults me, and you're kicking me out? It's not like that, Mom. It's just that Jessica and I need our space. You need your independence. It'll be better for everyone. He spoke in rehearsed phrases, empty corporate words that someone else had put into his mouth. My son was no longer there. Only a stranger wearing his face remained. When? I asked, feeling the tears burn behind my eyes. Tomorrow morning. I'll call you an Uber. You can stay in a hotel while you find something more permanent. I'll help you out with some expenses. At first, he was firing me as if I were an employee. He didn't even have the courage to look me in the eye. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed looking at my photos of Henry, wondering what he would say if he could see me now. I packed my things slowly, carefully folding each garment, as if keeping outward order could somehow contain my internal chaos. At dawn, I heard the honk of a car outside. Richard was waiting by the front door with $200 bills in his hand. To help you get settled, he said, still not daring to look at me. I didn't hug him. I didn't say goodbye. I just took the cash, grabbed my bags, and walked out of that house without ever looking back. The driver asked me where I wanted to go. I didn't have an answer. I just told him to take me to any cheap motel. He drove me to a spot on the outskirts of Chicago, near the interstate. It was one of those roadside motels with flickering neon signs and carpets that smelled like stale dampness. The room cost $45 a night. I did the math in my head. With $200, I wouldn't even make it a week. It was a tiny room with stained beige walls and a mattress that squeaked every time I moved. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where cars pulled in and out at all hours. The neon light flickered every few seconds, painting the room in a sickly reddish glow. I sat on the bed, and for the first time in months, I wept uncontrollably. These weren't silent tears. They were deep, gut-wrenching sobs dragged up from a dark corner of my chest. They were years of accumulated pain, of swallowed humiliations, of words left unspoken. I cried for Henry, who had passed away and left me completely alone in a world I no longer recognized. I cried for Richard, the little boy who once hugged me and called me his hero. I cried for myself, for the woman I used to be and who now didn't even know who she was. When the tears finally dried up, only emptiness remained. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror under the cruel, buzzing fluorescent light. A 7-1-year-old woman stared back at me, deep wrinkles, swollen eyes, unkempt gray hair. On my temple, there was an ugly purple bruise, the mark of the ladle. I touched the injury carefully and realized that the physical pain was almost a relief compared to the other pain, the one that had no name. The days began to blur together. I stayed in the room all the time, watching the television without really seeing it, eating barely enough to survive. I only went out to buy snacks from the vending machine in the hallway, salty potato chips, instant coffee, granola bars. Once, the machine swallowed my last few dollar bills without giving me anything in return. I just stood there watching my money disappear and thought it was a perfect metaphor for my life. I sent text messages to Richard. At first, I tried to maintain some dignity. Son, I need to talk to you. Nothing. Then I got more direct. Richard, I'm running out of money. Silence. Eventually, I stopped trying. The messages showed up as read, but there was never a reply. It was like shouting down a bottomless well. A week later, the money ran out. The motel clerk, a man in his 40s with a prominent beer belly and tired eyes, knocked on my door. Ma'am, I need you to pay up or vacate the room. His voice wasn't cruel, it was just professional, distant. I explained my situation, begged him for just one more day, but he only shook his head. I'm sorry, ma'am. It's policy. I packed my bags again, 4 in total, and they weighed as if they were filled with my own dead memories. I dragged them across the asphalt parking lot under a scorching sun, with absolutely nowhere to go. I walked for hours. My feet throbbed, my hands were covered in blisters from the heavy luggage, but I kept moving because stopping meant accepting that I didn't belong anywhere anymore. I ended up in a park near downtown Chicago. There were metal benches under the oak trees, pigeons pecking at crumbs, kids playing on the swings. I sat on a secluded bench and watched life carry on as if I didn't even exist. A woman walked by with her young daughter. The little girl stared at me with curiosity, but her mother squeezed her hand and quickened her pace, as if poverty were contagious. That was my first night sleeping on the street. I didn't actually sleep. I sat bolt upright, clutching my purse, startled by every passing siren or noise. There were other homeless people in the park, mostly men huddled under pieces of cardboard. One of them walked over and offered me a piece of stale bread. "Eat up, Grandma," he said. "Stay safe out here." I took the bread with trembling hands and thanked him. He nodded and walked away, dragging a garbage bag full of crushed aluminum cans. The days morphed into a grim routine of survival. I searched for food in the dumpsters behind restaurants. At first, I was deeply disgusted, deeply ashamed, but starvation is much stronger than pride. I found day-old bread, bruised fruit, scraps that people had left on their plates. I ate hiding in alleyways so no one would see me. There was a church a few blocks away that served soup on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I stood in line with dozens of other people, all with broken stories written across their faces. A young volunteer handed me a bowl with a smile so full of pity that, instead of comforting me, it made me feel even smaller. "God bless you," she said. I just nodded, completely unable to utter a single word. The nights were the worst. Freezing, endless, loaded with fear. I slept on a park bench surrounded by my suitcases, using my cardigan as a blanket. I listened to distant police sirens, occasional shouts, and the constant hum of a city that never rested. I thought of Richard, sleeping in his warm bed, in his heated house, while I shivered beneath the stars. I wondered if he thought of me, if he cared, if he even knew his mother was sleeping on the concrete. One morning, a police officer woke me up with the beam of his flashlight. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. You need to move along." I explained to him that I had nowhere to go. He sighed with the deep exhaustion of a man who had heard far too many stories just like mine. "There's a shelter 6 blocks down. Go there." He handed me a slip of paper with the address and walked away. I went, but the shelter was at full capacity. "Come back early tomorrow," they told me. It was always tomorrow. Always wait. Never right now. 2 weeks passed, maybe 3. I had lost all track of time. The days melted into a thick fog of exhaustion and hopelessness. My clothes were filthy, my hair was greasy, my skin covered in grime. I had become one of those invisible people that everyone avoids making eye contact with, just another statistic, a shadow. But in the midst of so much suffering, something completely unexpected happened. I began to remember things I had forgotten. I remembered that before marrying Henry, I had wanted to study literature. I remembered that I had once won a poetry contest in high school. I remembered that there was a time when I had my own dreams, long before I became a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and a shadow. One afternoon, while digging through my suitcases looking for clean underwear, I found an envelope I didn't remember packing. It was old, yellowed, with my name written in Henry's unmistakable handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. I tore it open with trembling hands. Inside, there was a letter and several heavily folded legal documents. The letter began with, "My dearest Helen." I immediately realized when he had written it. It was 2 years ago, when Henry was hospitalized with severe pneumonia. I thought it had just been a scare, but at that moment, I understood he had truly faced his own mortality. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you," the letter read. "Forgive me for not telling you everything while I was alive. I always wanted to protect you from the stress of money, business, and legal entanglements, but I now realize it was a mistake to keep you in the dark." My eyes filled with tears as I read. In every word, I could hear Henry's voice. Over the last 30 years, I made investments. Small ones at first, much larger ones later on. I bought properties when nobody wanted them, in neighborhoods that eventually gentrified and became highly valuable. I saved every extra penny. I did it all thinking of our future, of your peace of mind. I never told you because I didn't want you to worry, because I dreamed of surprising you in our old age with the absolute peace of knowing you would be well taken care of. I felt my breathing accelerate. I unfolded the heavy documents that came with the letter. They were property deeds, investment certificates, Financial statements. My eyes scanned the pages, utterly unable to believe what they were reading. An apartment building downtown, another in the north side, shares in mutual funds, bank accounts with balances that looked entirely fake. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the papers. I read each document once, twice, 3 times, desperately trying to process it. There were 13 properties solely in my name, 13 entire buildings, apartment complexes, commercial retail spaces. And one of the addresses struck me with painful familiarity. 452 Magnolia Avenue. It was the luxury apartment building where Richard and Jessica lived. The very same place where I had been kicked out, humiliated, struck with a ladle, and treated like garbage. It was mine. It had been mine this entire time. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't just shock. It was a potent mix of disbelief, deep sorrow, and something much darker that was beginning to take root inside me. Henry's letter continued on the second page. Contact the attorney, Robert Mitchell. He has all the original certified documents and will assist you with everything. His number is at the bottom of this page. Helen, my love, never allow anyone to make you feel less than you are. You are a strong, capable, and deeply valuable woman. If anyone ever mistreats you, remember that you have the power to defend yourself. I loved you every single day of my life. Take care of yourself. Yours, Henry. I sat on that metal park bench, surrounded by my battered suitcases, holding the physical proof that I was not the helpless vagrant everyone walking by thought I was. I was the sole owner of a real estate empire valued in the millions of dollars. Millions. And yet, I had been sleeping on the pavement, eating out of trash cans, begging for scraps of stale bread. The irony was so brutally cruel I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I ended up doing both. I laughed like a madwoman while dirty tears streamed down my smudged cheeks. People walking their dogs looked at me with pity or fear, steering clear of the crazy old bag lady in the park. But I was no longer that woman. Or maybe I was, but now I knew something they didn't. I rummaged through my purse until I found a handful of change and walked to a public payphone that miraculously still worked. I dialed attorney Robert Mitchell's number with trembling fingers. It rang 3 times before a crisp, professional voice answered. Law offices of Mitchell and Associates. How may I direct your call? I need to speak with Mr. Robert Mitchell. It's regarding Henry Sullivan. My voice sounded raspy, broken, after weeks of barely using it. There was a brief pause. May I ask who is calling? I am Helen Sullivan, Henry's widow. Another, much longer pause. Mrs. Sullivan, we have been trying to locate you for months. Where are you currently located? Mr. Mitchell needs to see you immediately. I gave them the cross streets of the park. They told me they would send a car in under 30 minutes. I walked back to my bench and waited, clutching those documents as if they were the only real thing left in the universe. Perhaps they were. The car that arrived was an elegant black Lincoln Town car with heavily tinted windows. The driver stepped out and looked at me with a perfectly neutral, professional expression, as if picking up homeless women from public parks was just part of his daily routine. Mrs. Sullivan? I nodded. He loaded my filthy suitcases into the trunk and opened the rear door for me. The interior smelled of rich leather and expensive air freshener. I felt disgusting, completely out of place, but I no longer cared. The law firm was located in the Loop, the heart of the financial district, in one of those towering glass skyscrapers that reflect the clouds. We rode up a silent, high-speed elevator to the 15th floor. The receptionist eyed me up and down without uttering a single word. She simply gestured toward a long hallway. Mr. Mitchell is waiting for you in his office. Robert Mitchell was a man in his early 50s with perfectly styled graying hair and thin wire-rimmed glasses. He stood up the moment I walked in, and for a split second I saw the shock register on his face upon seeing my dreadful state. But he instantly recovered his professional composure. Mrs. Sullivan, please, have a seat. Can I offer you some water? Coffee? Water, please, I rasped. It was barely a whisper. He poured a glass from a crystal pitcher on his desk and handed it to me. I drank it as if I hadn't had fresh water in days, which, in a way, was true. Mrs. Sullivan, we have been trying desperately to locate you ever since Henry passed away. We left voicemails at your old landline. We sent certified letters. Your son informed us that you had moved out, but he refused to provide us with any forwarding address or contact information. My son, The words tasted bitter in my mouth. My son kicked me out of his house 3 weeks ago. I've been living on the streets. The lawyer furrowed his brow deeply. I understand. I am incredibly sorry to hear that. But I need you to know that your financial situation is incredibly secure. Your husband was a man of immense foresight. Have you reviewed the documents he left you? I pulled the crumpled envelope from my purse and placed it on his polished mahogany desk. I found these yesterday. I don't fully understand everything they say. Robert examined them carefully. Ah, I see. These are photocopies. I have the certified originals right here in my vault. Allow me to explain your current standing, Mrs. Sullivan. You are the sole owner of 13 commercial and residential properties in the Chicago metropolitan area, with a total estimated market value of roughly $8 million. In addition, you hold investments in mutual funds and stocks valued at an additional $2 million. Your husband also left you 3 liquid bank accounts with immediate cash access of approximately. The numbers floated in the air as if they were entirely fictional. $10 million, $10 million, and I had been digging for half-eaten sandwiches in dumpsters. That can't be real, I muttered. It is entirely real, Mrs. Sullivan, and there is something else you need to know. One of your properties is the luxury mid-rise located at 452 Magnolia Avenue. According to our tenant records, your son, Richard Sullivan, and his wife Jessica currently occupy Unit 301 inches, that exact building. That's correct, I nodded slowly. They do. Then, you should know that they have been living there under a heavily reduced rental agreement that your husband granted them 5 years ago. They currently pay a mere $400 a month for an apartment that holds a fair market value of roughly $2,500. It was a family favor Mr. Sullivan set up for them. $400. Richard was paying $400 to live in a luxury Chicago apartment thanks to his father's extreme generosity, and he had thrown me out onto the concrete. He had left me with nothing. The lawyer kept talking, explaining dense details about property taxes, LLCs, and management logistics, but I barely heard a word. My mind was furiously processing something else entirely. Can I cancel that lease agreement? I asked suddenly, cutting him off. Robert stopped and looked at me intently. You are the legal owner, Mrs. Sullivan. You can do whatever you wish with your properties. However, there are state laws and procedures we must follow. You cannot simply evict them without proper legal notice. I don't want to evict them. Not yet. The words came out cold, highly calculated. I want to adjust their rent to the actual market rate, the $2,500 you mentioned. I want them paying exactly that. The lawyer nodded slowly. That is well within your legal rights. We would need to serve them a standard 30-day notice regarding the change in lease terms and rent increase. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? Completely certain. Robert took notes on his legal pad. Very well. I will have my paralegals draft the necessary notices immediately. Now, Mrs. Sullivan, there are much more pressing matters we must address. Your living situation, for example. You have several options. You can move into any of your currently vacant units, or I can help you secure a temporary luxury residence while you decide your next steps. I want to see the other buildings, all of them. I want to know exactly what it is that I own. Of course. We can arrange guided property tours starting tomorrow. In the meantime, please allow me to book you a hotel room, a proper place where you can rest, bathe, and recover. He stood up and made a quick phone call. In a matter of minutes, everything was completely arranged. A 5-star hotel right in downtown Chicago, an executive suite, everything billed directly to my own accounts. Before I left, Robert handed me a sleek black debit card. This gives you direct access to one of your primary checking accounts. There is currently $50,000 in available funds for your immediate expenses. Use whatever you need. And Mrs. Sullivan, one last thing. Your husband asked me to give you something if you ever came to my office under difficult circumstances. He made me swear to it. He pulled a heavy, wax-sealed envelope from his desk drawer. He told me verbatim, "If my Helen ever comes to you defeated by life, hand her this and tell her I always knew she was stronger than she believed." I took the envelope with hands that were finally steadying. I opened it right there, in front of Robert. It was another letter from Henry. This one was much shorter, written in black ink on thick cardstock. My love, if you are reading this, It means someone has hurt you so deeply that you finally decided to seek help. I know your pride. I know how difficult it is for you to ask for anything. But I want you to know one thing. I built this entire empire for you. Every property, every investment, every penny saved was with the thought of the day when I would no longer be around and you would need to defend yourself. Do not let anyone, not even our own flesh and blood, make you feel small. You are a giant, Helen. You always have been. Now, go prove it. Tears streamed freely down my cheeks as I read. Robert had the grace to look away, pretending to closely inspect a legal brief. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away next to the first one. Henry had known. Somehow, he had sensed that one day I would need this: a shield, a suit of armor, a fortress of my own. The hotel was everything my life had recently ceased to be. Plush carpeting, sheets that smelled of fresh lavender, a massive bathroom with a marble-soaking tub. I stood in the middle of the suite for several minutes, simply staring. It felt like a hallucination. 24 hours ago, I was sleeping on a frozen park bench. Now, I was standing in a room that cost $300 a night. The very first thing I did was draw a bath. I filled the deep tub to the brim with scalding hot water and completely submerged myself. The water quickly turned murky with the accumulated grime of my weeks on the streets. I scrubbed my skin until it burned bright red. I washed my hair 3 separate times, aggressively washing away every last trace of the street from my body. When I stepped out, I wrapped myself in a thick, white terry cloth robe hanging on the back of the door. It was so incredibly soft, it almost made me cry all over again. I ordered room service: creamy soup, freshly baked sourdough bread, roasted chicken, a crisp salad, and a slice of pie. When the bellhop rolled in the cart covered with a pristine white tablecloth, I sat down and ate slowly, savoring every single bite. It wasn't just food. It was human dignity. It was power. It was undeniable proof that I still existed as something more than a ghost. I slept for 12 straight hours that night. I slept without jumping at shadows, without terror, without the biting cold. When I finally woke up, the morning sun was filtering through the sheer curtains, and for a split second, I didn't remember where I was. Then, it all came rushing back. The legal documents, the millions, the properties, my brand new reality. Over the following days, Robert personally drove me to see every single one of my properties. High-rise apartment complexes, downtown retail storefronts, and even a bustling little strip mall down in the south suburbs. Each location represented decades of Henry's silent, patient labor investments made with brilliant foresight. Robert explained exactly how everything operated: the commercial leases, the property management firms, the monthly cash flow. I listened intently, taking copious notes like a dedicated college student. The net operating income across all your properties totals roughly $45,000 a month, he told me one afternoon while we reviewed profit and loss statements in his boardroom. After property taxes and maintenance overhead, we are talking about $400,000 a year in pure liquid profit, and that is without even touching your principal capital. $400,000 a year. And I had been standing in line for a bowl of watery soup at a church. The irony remained incredibly brutal, but now, there was something else entirely. A plan was beginning to take shape in my mind. A cold, highly calculated, and patient plan. "Robert, I need us to make some structural changes," I told him later that week, "but I want it done with absolute discretion. No one can know that I am the one pulling the strings behind the curtain." He leaned back in his leather chair, highly intrigued. "What kind of changes?" "First, the building on Magnolia Avenue. I want to raise my son's rent to market value, as we discussed. But I also want you to audit every single lease agreement in that building. If there are any special handshake deals, unrecorded discounts, or legacy favors being granted, I want everything yanked back to standard market rates. All of them. I want that building operated like a ruthless corporate entity, not a charity ward." Robert nodded, his pen flying across his legal pad. "Consider it done." "Anything else?" "I want to buy a completely new wardrobe. I want to change my physical appearance, and I need a corporate umbrella name, an LLC that I can use to sign legal documents and appear on all leases. I absolutely do not want anyone to know that Helen Sullivan owns this empire. We can easily form a limited liability company. We pick a corporate name, and all official documents are signed under that entity. You will remain the hidden beneficiary." It's completely legal and standard practice in commercial real estate. Perfect. Set up Harbor View Enterprises, LLC. Over the next 2 weeks, I transformed. I went to high-end salons on the Magnificent Mile, where stylists cut and colored my hair, covering my unkempt grays with an elegant, rich chestnut tone. I visited luxury boutiques where attentive associates helped me select garments that fit perfectly, clothes that made me look exactly like the woman of immense resources I now was. Tailored pearl gray dresses, earth-toned pantsuits, deep forest green silk blouses, nothing gaudy or flashy, everything reeked of quiet wealth. I bought designer glasses with sharp, modern frames. I got professional manicures. I learned how to apply just enough high-end makeup to soften my deepest wrinkles. I wasn't pretending to be someone else. I was excavating the Helen that had been buried alive under 50 years of silent servitude. Robert taught me how to read financial disclosures, how to interpret bank statements, and how to make cutthroat business decisions. I learned astonishingly fast, discovering a sharp, analytical part of my brain that had never been given permission to develop. I had spent 50 years cooking and scrubbing, but my mind remained incredibly sharp, highly capable, and starving for knowledge. "You have a real talent for this," Robert told me one afternoon. "Your husband picked phenomenal investments, but you have a killer instinct for spotting market opportunities. It comes naturally to you." Maybe it was true. Maybe it had always been true, but no one had ever given me the chance to find out. Henry had been a fundamentally good man, a deeply loving husband, but even he had kept me locked out of the financial world, thinking he was protecting my fragile sensibilities. I now understood that true power didn't lie in being protected by someone else. It lay in having the tools to protect yourself. The official notices of rent increases were mailed out via certified mail to all tenants at the Magnolia Avenue building, signed exclusively by Harborview Enterprises, LLC, and legally represented by Mitchell and Associates. The hikes were perfectly legal within Chicago ordinances, but they were steep, especially for those who had coasted on heavily discounted rates for years. Robert kept me updated on the fallout. Several tenants called in a fury, others tried desperately to negotiate. "We have one tenant in particular who has called the firm 7 times today," Robert mentioned one afternoon. "Unit 301, a Richard Sullivan. He claims he had a special verbal contract with the previous owner and insists there must be some kind of clerical error." "There is no error," I replied calmly. "Tell him that his special contract expired the second Henry Sullivan's heart stopped beating. He pays the new market rate or he vacates the premises. He's aggressively demanding to speak directly to the property owner. Tell him the owner is unavailable. All communication goes strictly through you." Days passed, and Robert continued to update me. "Mr. Sullivan is trying to secure a bank loan to cover the new rental amount. Apparently, he and his wife live drastically beyond their means. They have maxed-out credit cards, 2 heavily financed luxury cars. This rent hike is backing them into a severe financial corner." Good. The word came out of my mouth devoid of any emotion. I didn't feel smug satisfaction exactly, but I didn't feel a shred of maternal guilt either. I was simply watching the natural consequences of the arrogant choices Richard had made. He had chosen a wife who spent money faster than he could print it. He had chosen to live a life of luxury that he could only afford because he was leeching off his father. He had chosen to kick his elderly mother onto the frigid streets of Chicago. Now, the bill for those choices had arrived. But I wasn't finished. There were still levers left to pull. Jessica worked as an independent consultant from home. I did a little digging using the corporate databases Robert provided me. I discovered that one of her largest anchor clients leased retail space in one of my properties, the strip mall down in the south suburbs. "Robert, that consulting client renting unit 203 inches the South Plaza, what's their current lease rate?" He checked his digital files. $2,200 a month. It's a large commercial space, highly profitable business. They always pay exactly on the first. Raise their rent to $3,500 at their upcoming renewal. That is a massive hike, Mrs. Sullivan. They might decide to break the lease and relocate. Then let them relocate. It's my property, and I want to charge what the square footage is actually worth. The tenant in Unit 203 didn't relocate, but they immediately had to slash their operating budget to afford the hike. One of the very first things they axed was their 1,099 contracts with external consultants, including Jessica. Robert mentioned it to me almost as an afterthought during our weekly briefing. By the way, it seems your aggressive pricing strategy is having secondary market effects. That business in the South Plaza just terminated several vendor contracts to balance their books. One of them was with a Jessica Sullivan, your daughter-in-law. I didn't say a word. I just nodded and went back to reviewing the quarterly reports, but deep inside, I felt something that tasted a lot like satisfaction. It wasn't quite revenge yet. It was pure justice. It was the universe forcefully correcting itself, stripping away unearned privilege, balancing the grand ledger. Weeks turned into months. I continued living in the luxury hotel, studying, learning, and evolving. I enrolled in an online real estate management certification. I devoured books on corporate finance that I previously never had the time to even open. I networked with other commercial landlords Robert introduced me to, absorbing their ruthless experience. One afternoon, while I was sipping an espresso on the hotel terrace, Robert called my cell phone. "Mrs. Sullivan, there is a development you need to be made aware of. Your son, Richard, requested an emergency meeting with the property management group. He is now exactly 2 full months behind on his rent. According to standard Illinois lease agreements, we have the legal right to file a 5-day notice and initiate formal eviction proceedings. How much does he owe? Exactly $5,000 in back rent, plus $1,200 in late fees and penalties. $6,200 total. He could have paid that off with the cash I was carrying in my designer handbag at that exact moment, but I wasn't going to bail him out. Serve him the notice and proceed with the eviction. Follow every legal protocol to the letter." "Of course. Are you absolutely certain?" "Once we file the unlawful detainer, the process becomes public record. It goes before a civil court judge, and an eviction will permanently destroy his credit score." "I am completely certain." I didn't sleep that night. Not out of guilt or remorse, but due to a cocktail of emotions so bizarre I didn't even know how to label them. I stood in front of the bathroom vanity mirror, staring at the woman looking back. She was not the same broken woman who had limped into Robert's law firm 2 months prior. This woman kept her shoulders squared, her gaze unflinching, her jaw locked in total determination. This woman did not beg. This woman did not apologize for breathing. This woman collected exactly what she was owed. The following days were a whirlwind of legal maneuvers. Robert kept me updated on every procedural step. The eviction notice was officially served by a process server. Richard had an increasingly narrow window to pay the debt in full or surrender the keys. According to Robert, my son was frantically calling the law firm every single day, sometimes 5 times a day, demanding to speak to the owner, begging for extensions, offering pathetic payment plans. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Exactly what you instructed. That corporate policy applies equally to all tenants. That Harbor View Enterprises makes 0 exceptions. That if he cannot pay the balance in full, he must vacate." Perfect. But there was something else Robert didn't know, something I had been orchestrating on my own. I had hired a private investigator, not to spy on him maliciously, but to genuinely understand. I needed to know exactly how my son had spiraled to this pathetic point. I needed to comprehend what had happened to the little boy I had raised. The PI's report arrived a week later in a manila folder. It was far more depressing than I had imagined. Richard earned a solid salary as a regional sales manager, but Jessica spent money 3 times faster than he earned it. Credit cards were maxed out to the absolute limit. They were taking out high-interest personal loans just to make minimum payments on other loans. They dined out at River North steakhouses 5 nights a week. Jessica bought designer clothes she wore once for Instagram and left rotting in the back of her closet. It was a terrifying house of cards built entirely on crippling debt and fake social media appearances. The investigator also included notes on the state of their marriage. They had been having vicious public screaming matches. Neighbors were constantly filing noise complaints regarding slamming doors, shattered glass, and screaming fits followed by days of icy silence. Jessica blamed Richard for not being a real provider. Richard blamed Jessica for bankrupting them. It was a toxic, vicious cycle of deep resentment. I read the entire report twice. A small, lingering part of me, the part that would forever be a mother, wanted to intervene. I wanted to call Richard, bail him out, and guide him toward financial literacy. But the other part of me, the newer, much harder part, knew that doing so would be a fatal mistake. Richard needed to hit absolute rock bottom. He needed to be crushed by the consequences of his own arrogance. It was the only way he would ever grow up. Besides, he had let me hit rock bottom. He had watched me lying on his kitchen floor, bleeding from the head, humiliated, and his instinct was to turn up the TV volume. He threw me out onto the street with $200 and a vague, empty promise of help. He never called to check if I had frozen to death. He didn't care if I was sleeping on a bench. He simply didn't care. That was the cold truth that hurt more than any physical blow. My son had stopped caring about me long before he kicked me out. Maybe I had never truly mattered to him at all. Maybe he had only ever seen me as an inherited burden, an annoying obligation he had finally found an excuse to throw in the trash. On the final day before the legal eviction filing, Robert called me. He paid. He came up with the money somehow. He wired the $6,200 this morning. I felt a bizarre pang of disappointment. Where did he get it? I don't know for certain, but I have a strong theory. My paralegals flagged a new hard inquiry on his credit report. A personal loan from a predatory payday lender with a 32% APR. He likely borrowed the money from them just to keep a roof over his head. 32% interest. Richard had merely traded a bad debt for a catastrophic one. He had bought himself a few weeks of breathing room, but he had solved absolutely nothing. I understand. Keep monitoring the accounts. Let me know the second he slips again. 2 weeks later, rent was due for the next month. Or rather, it wasn't paid. Richard fell behind immediately. File the unlawful detainer with the Cook County courts immediately, I instructed Robert. No more warnings. We play by the absolute letter of the law. While the legal gears of the eviction machine grinded forward, my personal transformation continued. I enrolled in morning yoga classes not because I needed the workout, though it helped my joints tremendously, but because I needed to learn how to exist in silence with my own thoughts. Breathing, just living without the constant white noise of serving others, became an entirely new way of life. I also started journaling. I bought a thick, brown leather notebook and an expensive fountain pen, and every night before bed, I sat at my hotel desk and wrote. It wasn't a diary, exactly. It was a repository for my philosophy reflections on who I had been, who I was now, and who I was actively choosing to become. I wrote about Henry, about our 5 decades together, about the resentment I harbored for him keeping me in the dark. I wrote about Richard, about the crushing realities of motherhood, about how sometimes pure love just isn't enough to save someone. One afternoon, while I was writing on the hotel terrace, an elderly woman sat down at the table next to mine. She must have been pushing 80, maybe older, with perfectly styled silver hair and piercing blue eyes that commanded instant respect. "Excuse me for interrupting," she said in a refined voice. "But I have observed you sitting here several times, always writing, always alone. You remind me so much of myself, many decades ago." I smiled politely, assuming this was the prelude to some MLM pitch or religious pamphlet, but she simply continued. I, too, went through a very late-stage metamorphosis in my life. When my husband passed, I realized I had no idea who I was without him anchoring me. I had been a corporate wife, a mother, a grandmother, but I had never been just me. So, I had to learn. Is that what you're doing? Her words struck me with an uncomfortable precision. Something like that, I admitted. The hardest part isn't figuring out who you are, she said, looking out over the Chicago skyline. The hardest part is giving yourself the absolute permission to be that person. Especially when the woman you discover is not the sweet, compliant woman everyone else demands you be. She looked me dead in the eye. But it is worth it, believe me. It is worth every bit of the fallout. She stood up, gave my shoulder a gentle, reassuring pat, and walked away. I never learned her name. I never saw her in the hotel again, but her words anchored themselves deep in my chest. She was entirely correct. The difficult part wasn't figuring out who Helen was without Henry, without Richard, without the suffocating role of the selfless martyr mother. The difficult part was giving myself permission to be a ruthless businesswoman, a woman who collected her debts, who didn't forgive just out of sheer habit, who set ironclad boundaries and violently enforced them. The eviction lawsuit marched forward relentlessly. Robert emailed me updates every 48 hours. Richard had hired a dirt-cheap legal aid lawyer who was desperately throwing legal technicalities at the wall, trying to stall the inevitable. They argued that the rent increase was retaliatory and excessive, that certain obscure municipal protocols had been skipped, that they deserved a hardship extension. but Robert had executed everything flawlessly. Every single document was legally bulletproof. Every certified mail receipt was logged. There was zero escape. "The eviction hearing is scheduled for next Thursday morning," Robert informed me over the phone. "It's merely a formality at this point. With the paper trail we have, the judge will rule in our favor immediately. Your son will be given an order of possession, giving him a maximum of 10 days to vacate before the Cook County Sheriff physically removes him." "I'll be there," I said suddenly. Robert paused, clearly surprised. "Your presence isn't legally required, Mrs. Sullivan. I can act entirely as your proxy. In fact, it is highly recommended that you do not attend to maintain your corporate anonymity. I want to be in that courtroom, just sitting in the gallery, as an anonymous observer." He thought for a moment before responding. "You have that right." Thursday arrived with a slate-gray Chicago sky threatening freezing rain. I dressed with meticulous care. I chose a charcoal-gray tailored suit and an ivory silk blouse. I pulled my hair back into a severe, elegant chignon, put on my designer glasses, and applied a subtle but sharp touch of makeup. Looking in the mirror, I saw a woman Richard would absolutely never recognize. I was no longer the hunched, battered mother cooking soup in his kitchen. I was someone entirely different. Someone made of steel. The courthouse was a brutalist concrete building with long, echoing hallways that smelled of old paperwork and burnt coffee. I arrived early and took a seat in the very back row of courtroom 3, where the civil hearings were being held. There were dozens of other people waiting for their own cases to be called, all sharing that identical, tense exhaustion that the judicial system forces upon you. Richard walked in 15 minutes before the docket began. He was accompanied by Jessica and their lawyer, a remarkably young man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit. My son looked like a walking corpse. He had lost 10 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. He had deep, bruised bags under his eyes, and his hair was an unkempt mess. Jessica, on the other hand, looked ridiculous. She was impeccably dressed in an emerald green designer cocktail dress, wildly inappropriate for a morning eviction hearing, complete with stilettos and flawless makeup. But her face was twisted into a mask of pure, barely contained rage. They sat in the front row, their backs to me. I watched them the way one watches a stage play from the balcony with cold, clinical detachment. Jessica was furiously whispering in Richard's ear, aggressively pointing her finger at him. He simply nodded, thoroughly beaten, lacking the energy to even argue back. Their young lawyer was frantically flipping through his case files, visibly sweating. Robert arrived exactly on time, impeccable in a tailored black Tom Ford suit, carrying a genuine leather briefcase. He didn't even glance in my direction, just as we had agreed. He sat at the plaintiff's table, arranging his perfectly organized binders with a terrifying, quiet confidence. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew he had already won. The judge took the bench. A stern woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor. Case number 2026 ED 3478. Harborview Enterprises, LLC versus Richard and Jessica Sullivan. The bailiff announced. Richard's lawyer was the first to scramble to his feet. He nervously argued that the 600% rent increase was unconscionable, that his clients had been model tenants for 5 years under the previous ownership, and that they deserved equitable relief. His voice cracked. He knew he was sinking. Robert stood up calmly. He submitted the binders to the clerk, the original lease, the certified notices of the rent increase, the 5-day pay or quit notices, everything chronologically indexed. He concisely explained that the heavily discounted rate was a personal favor granted by the deceased former owner, and the new corporate management was simply bringing the unit to standard Chicago market rates, an action 100% legal under state law. Furthermore, Your Honor, Robert continued, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom, the defendants did not merely refuse to pay the adjusted market rate, they fell months into arrears. On one occasion, they paid under the direct threat of eviction, only to immediately default the very next month. This demonstrates a clear pattern of financial insolvency and an inability to honor their contractual lease obligations. The judge reviewed the documents in silence for 2 agonizing minutes. She looked down over her glasses at Richard. "Mr. Sullivan, is it true that you currently owe 2 full months of back rent under the legally noticed terms?" Richard stood up, bracing his hands on the table to keep from shaking. "Yes, Your Honor." "But the increase was so sudden, we had no time to financially prepare." If the court could just grant us a hardship extension, just 3 months so we can. Mr. Sullivan, the judge interrupted, her tone flat and final. You were served with the standard 30-day notice regarding the lease changes, exactly as Illinois law dictates. You had a full month to either accept the new terms or find alternative housing. Do you possess the $6,200 you owe the plaintiff at this exact moment? Richard looked at his lawyer, then stared at his shoes. No, Your Honor. Not at this moment. Then the court has no alternative but to rule in favor of the plaintiff. An order of possession is granted. Mr. Sullivan, you have exactly 10 days to vacate the premises and return the keys to management. If you fail to do so, the sheriff's department will execute a forced eviction. Next case. The gavel slammed down. The entire ordeal was over in less than 20 minutes. Richard stood frozen, staring blankly ahead as if his brain couldn't process the reality of being homeless. Jessica, however, exploded. This is a massive injustice. You can't do this to us. We have rights, she shrieked at the judge, completely losing her mind. But it was too late. The clerk was already calling the next docket number. Her young lawyer grabbed her arm, desperately trying to drag her out of the courtroom before the judge hit her with a contempt charge. She fought him, screaming absolute nonsense about corporate corruption and illegal slumlords. Richard followed them out in dead silence, dragging his feet, wearing the face of a man whose life was over. They walked right past my bench in the back row. They didn't even glance at me. I was just another anonymous face in the gallery, invisible, irrelevant. I watched the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind them, and I sat there for a few more minutes, letting reality settle into my bones. I had won. Legally, formally, undeniably, I had won. But I didn't feel the rush of euphoria I had expected. I just felt a bizarre, hollow echo, the kind of eerie silence that follows a violent hurricane. I exited the courthouse through a side door. Robert had texted me to meet him at a high-end coffee shop 2 blocks away. I found him in a private booth in the back. 2 black coffees already steaming on the table. Well, he said as I slid into the booth. It went exactly as we planned. How do you feel? I thought about the question. How did I actually feel? Strange, I admitted finally, like I just slammed a heavy door shut. But I don't know what's waiting for me in the new room. Robert nodded, fully understanding. What you did today was not cruelty, Mrs. Sullivan. It was accountability. Your son made a series of arrogant, foolish decisions that led him directly into that courtroom. You simply stopped shielding him from the consequences of his own actions. I know. Logically, my brain knows that. But the mother in me, that instinct is hard to kill. Even when the child becomes a monster, we drank our coffee in comfortable silence. Robert didn't push me to analyze it further. He was incredibly good at that, knowing exactly when silence was more valuable than legal advice. After a few minutes, he pulled a sleek manila folder from his briefcase. I have something else I need to show you. This arrived at the management office this morning. It's a formal hardship request from one of your other tenants at the Magnolia building. I opened the folder. It was a handwritten letter addressed to Harborview Enterprises. It was signed by a woman named Sarah Jenkins, the tenant in Unit 105. She explained that she was a newly single mother of 2 toddlers. She worked as an ER trauma nurse on the night shift, and she had never missed a rent payment in 4 years. She was asking, with immense respect and humility, if management could possibly reconsider the aggressive rent hike in her specific case, or at the very least, allow her to phase the increase in gradually over 6 months so she could pick up extra shifts to cover it. She had attached copies of her hospital pay stubs, bank statements, and glowing letters of recommendation from the hospital administration. I read the letter twice. What is your legal recommendation? I asked Robert. It is entirely your call. Legally, you have absolutely zero obligation to make any exceptions. But from a human perspective, this woman appears highly genuine, and she has a flawless payment history. Evicting a good tenant is costly. Keeping her might be smart business. I thought about Sarah Jenkins, a woman I had never met, working grueling night shifts surrounded by death, just trying to keep her kids fed. I thought about all the times I had been in her exact position, silently begging the universe for just a little bit of grace, a tiny scrap of human empathy. Approve her proposal. Phase the rent increase over 6 full months. And draft an addendum. If she maintains her perfect payment record for the next year, we will lock her rent in at 15% below market rate permanently." Robert smiled, a genuine, rare smile. "That is incredibly generous of you." "It isn't generosity, Robert. It is recognizing the distinct difference between someone who is genuinely fighting to survive and someone who is simply dodging their responsibilities." I signed the corporate approval right there on the table. It was a line in the sand I had deliberately chosen to draw. I would be utterly ruthless with those who had abused me, with those who coasted on unearned privilege and cruelty. But I absolutely refused to let my wealth turn me into a monster incapable of seeing real human struggle. The following days were highly tense. Robert forwarded me reports of Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to reverse the court's decision. He filed an emergency appeal, which bought him exactly 4 extra days of legal limbo. He tried to secure payday loans from even sketchier lenders, but his credit profile was now a smoking crater. He posted panicked ads online trying to liquidate his luxury furniture, flat-screen TVs, anything of value. The emergency appeal was tossed out by the appellate judge in 72 hours. The judge didn't even grant a hearing. He simply reviewed the slam-dunk paperwork and affirmed the eviction order. Richard now had less than 4 days to get out. According to the private investigator who was still tailing him, Richard and Jessica had started packing, but the screaming matches inside the apartment had reached a boiling point. Neighbors called the police twice this week for domestic disturbances. The PI informed me over the phone. Yesterday afternoon, Jessica stormed out of the lobby with 2 massive Prada suitcases and got into an Uber. She hasn't been back since. From what I can gather, she's moving back to her parents' house in Wisconsin. Richard is up there alone, packing everything into trash bags. The doorman mentioned he found your son sobbing in the hallway near the freight elevator at 3 a.m. The mental image hurt me much deeper than I had anticipated. My son, completely alone, crying in a hallway, stuffing the shattered remains of his fake life into garbage bags. But I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't drive over there. This had to play out. He had to hit the absolute bottom. 2 days before the sheriff was scheduled to change the locks, Robert received an unexpected phone call. It was Richard. "He called the firm an hour ago," Robert told me when we met that afternoon. "He is aggressively demanding to speak to the CEO of Harborview Enterprises. He says he has something crucial to say." He was literally begging my receptionist for a 10-minute meeting. "What did you have her tell him?" "That we would relay the message to the ownership board." Robert paused, looking at me carefully. "Do you want to grant him the meeting?" The question hung heavily in the air. Did I want to see my son? Did I want to hear his pathetic excuses? One part of me, the mother whose heart was permanently tethered to him, screamed yes. But the heavily armored businesswoman I had become hesitated. "Do you have any idea what he wants to say?" "None. Only that it's life or death, and he needs to explain something to the owner." I stared out the window of Robert's office for a long, agonizing minute. "Tell him the CEO has agreed to meet with him, but not as his mother, as the corporate representative of Harborview Enterprises, and it must happen on neutral ground, here, in your conference room, tomorrow at 3 p.m. Robert nodded slowly. "Understood. Do you want me sitting in the room as corporate counsel?" "No. I need to do this completely alone." I didn't sleep a wink that night. I paced my hotel suite, playing the upcoming conversation out in my head 1,000 different ways. I stood in front of the mirror and violently rehearsed, keeping my face completely blank, a mask of stone, refusing to let a single micro-expression of pity escape. I had to be an iron wall. I could not allow Richard to see a desperate mother starving for her son's affection. He needed to meet the CEO who had systematically destroyed his life. At 2:30 p.m. the next day, I arrived at Mitchell & Associates. Robert had vacated his personal corner office for me to use. I sat behind his massive mahogany desk, sinking into the black executive chair, the thick legal binders of Richard's eviction spread out perfectly in front of me. I looked flawless. A charcoal pinstripe suit, a cream silk blouse, hair pulled tight, severe glasses. I did not look like Helen the maid. I looked like Helen the executioner. At exactly 3 p.m., I heard muffled voices out at the reception desk. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Richard walked in alone. He stopped dead in his tracks the second his eyes met mine. For an agonizing, eternal moment, the room was utterly silent. I could physically see his brain misfiring, desperately trying to reconcile the impossibility of what he was looking at. First came total confusion, then absolute disbelief. Finally, sheer, horrifying shock. "Mom?" he whispered, as if he were looking at a ghost. "Take a seat, Richard." My voice came out like cracked ice. It was not the nurturing voice of a mother. It was the voice of a landlord. He stumbled forward like a drunk man, collapsing into the leather guest chair opposite the desk. He couldn't tear his eyes away from me. I don't understand. What are you doing here? Why are you dressed like that? Where have you been?" "I looked for you, Mom. I called you. I texted you." Lies. The words sliced through the corporate air like a scalpel. I checked my phone every single day. 0 missed calls, 0 text messages. After you dumped me on the street like garbage, you never once tried to find me. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed him. His eyes instantly welled up with tears. Jessica told me. She said it was better to give you space, that you were just throwing a tantrum, and that with time, Jessica said. I repeated, my tone dropping to sub-zero. "Richard, since when do you allow a spoiled brat of a wife to dictate whether or not you check to see if your own mother has frozen to death on the streets of Chicago?" It wasn't like that. Things were just complicated. The money, the job stress. Jessica was having panic attacks, and it was easier to. It was easier to forget I existed than to stand up to your wife. It wasn't a question, it was a damning statement of fact. He dropped his gaze to his lap, completely unable to deny it. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, Richard looked back up, and I saw a new question forming behind the panic in his eyes. "Mom, seriously, what are you doing here? Sitting at this desk, dressed like a CEO? Why did the lawyer let you use his office?" I took a deep, measured breath. This was the moment. The kill shot. I am not using his office, Richard. He vacated it for me because I am his highest-paying client. I am Harborview Enterprises, LLC. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. "What?" "The luxury building you've been living in. The other 12 commercial properties across the city. The multi-million-dollar stock portfolios. The liquid assets. It is all mine. Your father left every single penny of his empire to me. It has always been mine. And you have been paying $400 a month to live in a property that I legally own." Richard violently pushed himself up, the heavy leather chair nearly tipping over backward. No, that's impossible. Dad never said a word about any of this. Why didn't you say anything? And why the hell should I have? I snapped, my voice finally rising, letting a fraction of my boiling rage so you could keep demanding discounts, free rent, and special treatment while treating me like an unwanted dog? "We didn't know," he screamed, his voice cracking. If you had known what?" I interrupted, standing up to match him, slamming my palms on the desk. "You would have treated me like a human being? You would have respected me, Richard. Basic human decency shouldn't be contingent on how many zeros are in someone's bank account. I was your mother. That should have been enough." He collapsed back into the chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. He was sobbing, deep, ugly, humiliating sobs. "I'm sorry," he choked out through the tears. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I was a coward. I let Jessica abuse you. I let her kick you out. I turned up the damn TV volume when she hit you because I was too terrified of confronting her. Because it was easier to sacrifice my own mother than to risk blowing up my toxic marriage." The exact words I had waited months to hear finally tumbled out of his mouth, but I didn't feel the triumphant satisfaction I had craved. I just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion. And now, Richard? Are you suddenly full of remorse because you found out I'm a multimillionaire, because I hold the deed to the building you sleep in? Would you be sitting in this office begging for forgiveness right now if you still thought I was a broke old woman begging for change? He looked up, his face slick with tears, his eyes bloodshot. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice a pathetic whisper. "I honestly don't know, Mom. And that's the most sickening part. I don't know what kind of monster I turned into. I don't recognize the man who did those things to you. A man who left his own mother homeless just to keep his wife quiet. At least he was being honest. That was something." I sat back down, folding my hands neatly on the desk. Karma is undefeated. Your marriage is over, isn't it? He nodded, a jerky, broken motion. Jessica left me 3 days ago. She moved back to Wisconsin. She said she refuses to be married to a broke loser who can't even afford rent. She said she deserves a luxury lifestyle, and that this eviction is entirely my fault. And what do you think? I think she's right. He let out a dark, humorless laugh. I think I am a pathetic loser. I got fired from my logistics job 2 weeks ago, terminated for chronic lateness, blown quotas, and erratic behavior. I have over $90,000 in unsecured consumer debt. My credit score is destroyed. And in 48 hours, the sheriff is going to throw me out onto the street. It's incredibly poetic, isn't it? I made you homeless, and now I'm going to be sleeping on a park bench. It's not poetry, I said softly. It's consequences. He stared at me with those swollen, red eyes. Did you orchestrate all of this just to watch me bleed? Is that what you wanted? A masterclass in revenge? The question caught me off guard. Is that what I had wanted? I had spent months moving chess pieces, legally strangling his finances, applying pressure exactly where I knew it would shatter him. I had watched my son's life disintegrate in slow motion, and now that I had him sitting across from me, utterly destroyed, was I happy? No, I replied, genuinely surprised by the absolute certainty in my own voice. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted you to fully comprehend what it feels like to be discarded, ignored, and treated like you have absolutely zero value to the world. I wanted you to hit rock bottom at terminal velocity, so that you would finally be forced to rebuild yourself into a real man. And did you get what you wanted? He asked, barely audible. I hit rock bottom. What do you think? I looked at him for a long, heavy moment. I think you have. I don't think you can fall a single inch further than where you are right now. No job, no wife, no money, no home, no dignity, and no mother. Those last 2 words slipped out like a fatal blow. I stayed quiet, letting the absolute finality of the statement suffocate the room. Richard had truly hit the bottom. I could see it in the deadness of his eyes, in the defeated slump of his spine, in the pathetic tremor of his hands. This was the moment I had engineered. The exact second my son finally understood the catastrophic weight of his own betrayal. Do you know what the absolute worst part of all of it was, Richard? I finally said, leaning forward. It wasn't the searing pain of the metal ladle splitting my skin open. It wasn't sleeping on a frozen Chicago park bench. It wasn't digging half-eaten donuts out of a dumpster behind a Dunkin'. It was hearing the TV volume go up. It was knowing, with absolute certainty, that my own flesh and blood heard me scream in agony and deliberately chose to drown it out. He broke down again, burying his face in his arms on the desk, sobbing hysterically. I'm so sorry. I am so fucking sorry. If I could just go back in time. But you can't, I interrupted coldly. No one gets to go back. We only get to decide what we do with the time we have left. Richard looked up, a pathetic glimmer of terrified hope mixing with his despair. What happens now? I leaned back in the executive chair, studying him. My son. The baby I had rocked to sleep at 3 a.m. The toddler who used to run to me crying with scraped knees. The teenager who hugged me tight before driving off to his college dorm. All of that was still locked inside him, buried beneath a decade of toxic arrogance and spineless cowardice. But the man who had abandoned me to die was also sitting right there. Both versions of Richard were entirely real. The eviction stands, I said with absolute, unyielding firmness. I am not calling off the sheriff. You have to leave that apartment. You have to leave that fake, plastic life behind you. His face crumbled, but he nodded slowly. I know. I understand. I have no right to ask you to save me. I just have one question. Where were you before you found the lawyer? How did you survive? So, I told him. Not every gruesome detail, but enough. The terrifying, sleepless nights in the park, the gnawing, hollow starvation, the bone-chilling cold, the motel vending machine that stole my last $3. Every sentence was a poisoned dart, and I watched them bury themselves deep into his chest. I needed him to hear it. I needed him to bear the full psychological cost of his abandonment. When I finished, Richard was openly weeping, making no effort to wipe his face. I failed you in the most unforgivable way possible. Dad must be so incredibly ashamed of me. Wherever he is, he must absolutely despise me for what I did to his wife. Your father loved you, I said softly, even when you made catastrophic mistakes. But your father also understood that real love sometimes means letting people get crushed by the consequences of their own actions. That is exactly why he built this corporate fortress for me, so that I would have the financial firepower to destroy anyone who tried to break me, even you. Will you? Will you ever be able to forgive me? The question floated in the sterile office air, incredibly fragile. The honest truth was, I didn't know. I don't know, Richard. Forgiveness isn't something that can be legally mandated. It's not a light switch I can just flip back on simply because you finally apologized while staring down the barrel of homelessness. It is a grueling process. And before I even consider it, I need to see legitimate, sustained behavioral change, not just desperate, tearful promises from a man who has run out of options. He nodded, scrubbing his wet face with the sleeve of his jacket. What can I do? How do I prove to you that I'm not that guy anymore? It's not about proving anything to me. It's about you becoming a man that you actually respect. A man your father would have been proud to call his son. I stood up, signaling the absolute end of the meeting. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises before the sheriff physically removes you. I suggest you use that time wisely. Richard stood up slowly, as if the gravity in the room had tripled and every movement required agonizing effort. When he reached the heavy oak door, he stopped and turned back. Mom? One last thing. When I find a place to crash, when I finally manage to get my life out of the gutter, can I call you? Just to know that you're okay? I considered my response carefully. You can try, but I am making absolutely zero guarantees that I will pick up. Not until I see action. Words mean nothing to me anymore. He nodded, accepting the brutal terms of his surrender. Thank you for taking the meeting. Thank you for listening to me. I know I didn't deserve it. And with that, he walked out. I was left completely alone in the massive executive office, feeling the crushing weight of what had just transpired. It hadn't been the explosive, cinematic screaming match I had played out in my head. There was no dramatic table flipping, just the cold, clinical delivery of the absolute truth, served on a silver platter of inevitable consequences. The following days passed in a strange emotional purgatory. Robert informed me that Richard had voluntarily surrendered the apartment 24 hours before the sheriff's deadline. He had hired a cleaning crew with whatever pennies he had left and left the unit spotless. He surrendered the keys to the concierge. According to the doorman, he drove away in a beat-up U-Haul van with only 3 suitcases and the expression of a man walking to the gallows. Do we know where he went? I asked, instantly hating myself for caring. No, ma'am. He didn't leave a forwarding address. A powerful, instinctual part of me wanted to hire the PI to track him down, to ensure he at least had a roof over his head and wasn't sleeping in a shelter, but I brutally suppressed the urge. Richard was a 34-year-old man. He had to dig himself out of his own grave. I could not play his savior anymore. Jessica, meanwhile, had evaporated from the narrative entirely. According to the PI's final wrap-up report, she was permanently back in Wisconsin with her parents, aggressively blaming Richard for ruining her life. She posted passive-aggressive quotes on Facebook about weak men and wasted youth, completely refusing to acknowledge her own starring role in their financial suicide. Typical. With Unit 301 finally vacant, I decided to make some sweeping changes. I hired a high-end general contractor and completely gutted the apartment. We installed dark hardwood floors, knocked down walls, and put in state-of-the-art Wolf appliances. Unit 301 became the crown jewel of Magnolia Avenue. I leased it less than a week later to a young corporate lawyer for $3,000 a month. But the real estate portfolio wasn't the only thing that needed a renovation. I finally decided it was time to check out of the luxury hotel and build a real home. I pulled one of my smaller properties off the rental market, a charming, 2-bedroom brick bungalow in a quiet, leafy neighborhood up in Evanston, with a massive south-facing backyard. It featured a bright kitchen with bay windows and a sprawling wooden deck that was absolutely perfect for morning coffee. I spent weeks decorating it, completely refusing to hire an interior designer. This time, I wanted to curate my own life. I chose simple, Incredibly elegant, mid-century modern furniture. I hung my framed photographs of Henry in the living room, but I deliberately left plenty of empty wall space for new memories. I planted heirloom roses in the backyard, grew cherry tomatoes in terracotta pots, and set up a thriving herb garden right on the kitchen windowsill. I enrolled in an oil painting class at a local community center. It turned out I wasn't nearly as terrible as I thought I'd be. My first few canvases were absolute disasters, muddy blobs of color lacking any coherent structure. But eventually, I started painting things I actually loved. Simple Illinois landscapes, vibrant still lifes, and eventually, self-portraits that captured the fierce, unyielding woman I was rapidly becoming. I also started volunteering at the exact downtown homeless shelter that had turned me away that terrifying night, because they were at capacity. I served hot meals on the food line twice a week. I sat and listened to the tragic stories of the unhoused, intimately understanding that every single person there had taken their own unique, agonizing path to the bottom. I donated aggressively through Harborview Enterprises, but I also offered something significantly more valuable: my actual time and my genuine empathy. One bitterly cold Tuesday afternoon, while I was ladling beef stew onto plastic trays, I recognized a face in the line. It was the grizzled man from the park, the one who had handed me the stale bread on my first night on the streets. He looked a bit healthier now, cleaner, with a spark of actual hope in his eyes. "Grandma," he said, his eyes going wide with shock. "It's you. You look totally different." "I am," I replied, flashing a genuine smile. I finally found myself. 3 full months passed without a single word from Richard. He didn't call. He didn't text. A part of my brain felt a dark, heavy relief. Another part of my soul registered his prolonged absence as a jagged wound that refused to fully scar over. But I kept moving forward. I continued aggressively building my empire, discovering exactly who Helen Sullivan was when she wasn't playing the role of a mother, a wife, or a ghost. On a crisp Saturday morning, while I was out back pruning the roses, my iPhone buzzed in my apron pocket. Unknown number. I hesitated for a long second before swiping to answer. "Hello?" It was Richard's voice, but the cadence was entirely different. It was stripped of its old corporate arrogance. It sounded grounded, firm. "It's me. I know you said you probably wouldn't pick up, but I had to try." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "Where are you?" "I'm renting a tiny apartment, way out in the west suburbs. Nothing fancy at all, just a dingy studio above a dry cleaner. But it's mine. I pay the rent myself with my new job. I'm working the overnight shift at an Amazon fulfillment warehouse. It's grueling, zero glamour, but it's honest money. I'm chipping away at my debts, slowly but surely." I felt a tight, coiled spring inside my chest finally release some tension. "I'm glad to hear that, Richard." "Mom, I'm not calling to ask you for a dime. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know that I am trying. I'm going to an aggressively cheap therapist every Thursday. I'm really trying to deconstruct why I made the horrific choices I made, and why I let myself morph into a coward I don't even recognize." "That is a good first step, Richard, genuinely." There was a heavy, emotional silence on the line. Do you think that maybe, someday, we could just grab a cup of coffee? It doesn't have to be anytime soon. Whenever you want. If you're ever ready." I looked out over the roses I had planted with my own 2 hands, now blooming violently in shades of coral and deep yellow. I looked at the brick house I had transformed into my personal fortress, the entirely new life I had engineered from the ashes of my old one. "Maybe," I said finally, my voice soft but steady. "Someday, when we have both done the work and are actually ready." "That's fair. I can wait," he replied, and I could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. "I've finally learned how to be patient." His voice cracked, just a fraction. "I love you, Mom. I know I lost the right to say that a long time ago, but it's the truth." "I know," I whispered, and I gently ended the call. I sat down in the Adirondack chair on my wooden deck, wrapping my hands around a steaming mug of herbal tea, letting the bright morning sun warm my face. I hadn't fully forgiven Richard yet. Maybe I never entirely would. The scar was too deep, the betrayal too profound. But I had achieved something infinitely more valuable than closure or forgiveness. I had found absolute peace. I had unearthed my lethal inner strength. I had taken my voice back from the people who tried to silence it. I pulled my leather journal from the side table, uncapped my pen, and began to write. I learned to forgive myself for waiting 70 years to finally defend myself. I learned that prioritizing your own survival is not a selfish act. It is the absolute baseline of human dignity. It is the concrete foundation upon which every other beautiful thing is built. The Chicago wind rustled through the oak trees in my backyard. A cardinal chirped somewhere near the fence line. And I, Helen Sullivan, 71 years old, sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, survivor of catastrophic betrayal and abandonment, a woman violently reborn from her own ashes, simply existed, whole, unapologetic, free, and entirely, irrevocably, my own.